Too bad. Okay. Thank you all for showing up here today. Today we're going to give an update on criminal justice uh, systems and issues that are occurring in our community. We're going to talk about some of the history of what's happened with criminal justice, talk about what's happening now, get some updates as to what may be happening for the future as well. Um, and each of the speakers that you see here in front of you will be speaking, as well as myself. We'll have some time. If everything goes right, we'll have about 5 minutes at the end for questions that you may have. And then I want to point out for the people at home, unfortunately, we can't get your questions, but if you do have some questions that you want to answer, please contact any of the people that you see here. I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves before they start speaking. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Bruce Cox. I'm chair of the Criminal Justice Committee here at the church. And I hope we're informative for you today. To my right, my immediate right, is Kara Hendrickson, who's the Executive Director of Impact for Equity. And she is also a member here of our church, and we appreciate her coming here to speak about what she does professionally, and the rest of us are pretty much sort of amateurs. But first thing I wanted to point out was this: you may ask why you want to do this kind of work, and the Bible does point to, and I think it paraphrases it very well, why you want to do this kind of work, because we are called to do this kind of work. We are called to put ourselves in someone else's place. And if you do that, you'll immediately feel why this kind of work is important. With that, I'm going to pass it to Karen.
Let me just take it off the stand.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kara Hendrickson. For those of you who I haven't met, it's really such a pleasure to be with you this morning, and thanks to the committee for the great work that you all do. I have been asked this morning to focus on police accountability, and so I'll spend a few minutes just providing some updates about that subject. As Bruce mentioned, when I'm not here at church, in my day job, I am the Executive Director of Impact for Equity. We are a law and policy center that is focused on racial, economic, and social justice in Chicago and in Illinois. We used to be known as BPI, and we focus on housing and the criminal legal system. And so that means that in my day job, I spend quite a lot of time working with my colleagues at Impact for Equity, some of the other organizations that we'll be talking about today on other issues, focused on reducing the size of the criminal legal system and ensuring there's accountability and transparency in our systems of policing. Our goal at Impact for Equity, similar to how Bruce grounded us this morning in values, is to work for true community safety here and across our state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about police accountability structures this morning, because this congregation and this community has been focused on this issue, I understand, for many years, even prior to when my family joined you as members of this congregation. So I'm going to take us back in the time machine for a minute and ground us in somewhat recent events. As many of you know, police accountability has been an issue in Chicago and in our region for decades at least. But about 5-10 years ago, many of you in this room remember when the video of Laquan McDonald being killed by the Chicago Police Department was released. That video set in motion a number of activities, including the creation by the city of Chicago of a police accountability task force, led by then task force leader Lori Lightfoot. One of the recommendations that the police accountability task force made was for the creation of a community-led oversight body related to the Chicago Police Department. The reasoning by the Police Accountability Task Force was there's a huge deficit of trust between law enforcement in the city of Chicago and in our region, and in the people who our government is supposed to be serving. And so the creation of a structure that would bring in community voices and provide leadership for the police department was an important step forward to creating safety and building trust. That call for action led to the creation of a coalition of community groups that was called, and continues to be called GAPA. And here's where the story may begin to sound familiar to some of you. Impact for Equity, then BPI, was the backbone of the GAPA organization, and so worked with many, I suspect, voices in this room and others over the course of 5 years to bring that call to action to reality. The charge was, how do we create a community oversight structure in the city of Chicago that truly meets the needs and the demands of the communities, again, that the police are supposed to serve? So over the course of about 5 years, through meetings in basements and in community centers around the city of Chicago, an ordinance was drafted, a structure. What would this vision, how do we take this vision, identify what the priorities are to create accountability in the city of Chicago, turn it into law, what would ultimately become the law? That process took about 5 years, not only through visioning, learning from other cities, what had been successful other places, taking some lessons learned from what hadn't succeeded other places, really understanding what was unique to the city of Chicago and this region and what we needed here, and what would be successful in the city council and ultimately receive support from the city leadership. In 2021, what was originally the GAPA ordinance became merged with other pieces in the legislative process, was ultimately called the ECPS ordinance, the Empowering Communities for Public Safety ordinance, was passed. I'm going to use a lot of acronyms. I also used to work for the government, so I just speak in acronyms. So the Empowering Communities for Public Safety ordinance was passed. Success, hooray! This was the culmination of those 5 years of work that people here and many, many, many other people, of course, building on decades of activism, ultimately passed in 2021. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened after that. As you all may remember, having been aware of this effort when it was underway, the ECPS ordinance, this community oversight ordinance, created really two structures for the city of Chicago. One was the creation of a community commission for public safety and accountability. This is a 7-person commission that has oversight structure over the Chicago Police Department. What that means specifically is that the commission, I'll just call it the commission, has a leading role in guiding some of the really important aspects of decision-making in the Chicago Police Department. It has the ability to play a significant role in selecting key leaders that have to do with Chicago, the Chicago Police Department. It, for example, after having only been created and seated for less than a year, played a leading role in selecting the current superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, the person who leads the department, currently Superintendent Larry Snelling. It selects other leaders in the accountability space as well, including the police board. We'll come to that in a minute. It has the ability to create, through partnership with the department, policy for the police department. And the thinking here is, for years, and I would say continuing to this day, there are practices that the police department engages in that it shouldn't or that ought to be different. And when there is a gap, when the police department doesn't see the need to reform its policies, the commission really brings the voice of the community to say, here's something that we really need to be doing that we're not doing, or stop doing if we shouldn't be doing it, or do it differently. So it has policy-making authority. It also has an important convening function. So the Community Commission meets once a month. You may have read about some of the meetings. They are engaging and lively, and really take on some of the most pressing issues that we are thinking about as a city today. The meeting on Thursday, for example, related to traffic stops and the shooting of motorist Dexter Reed that many of you may have read about and heard about. So that's the authority of the commission. It really just took off almost as soon as it was created. There are interim commissioners that right now are in the process of being replaced by permanent commissioners. And the functions that I listed, it has engaged in almost all of them from day one. And so it's been a very, very active group. The second part of the ordinance was what I just described. The community commission is sort of the top-down approach, right? How do we have a commission that's really guiding from a leadership perspective the work that needs to happen to ensure our department is functioning the way it ought to? The second piece was a very local approach. It was the creation of, and is the creation of, district councilors across the city of Chicago. The city is divided from the police department's perspective into 22 police districts. So think, there are 50 wards, about twice as big as a ward in the city. And last year, city residents elected 3 district councilors on their ballot to serve as representatives in each of the 22 police districts. So this is hyper-local, democratically elected representation of district councilors meeting once a month with community members and with members of the police department to identify very local needs, goals, problems, opportunities, and partner with the department to make those happen. To the extent those districts are seeing common issues, common problems, common opportunities, those then get fed up to the commission, and the commission can exercise its policy-making authority. District councilors have been elected. There are 66 of them. They are a very energetic group, and those meetings happen every month across the city of Chicago, and they are debating and taking on some of the most pressing issues of policing possible. There's been a lot of activity generated by the commission and by these district councilors, a lot of it really positive, a lot of reforms are coming out of this group, and there's been a reaction as well. The commission is not the only part of the police accountability infrastructure. One of those other parts is the police board that I mentioned. This is a group that adjudicates individual cases of police misconduct. And the police board is selected in part now by the community commission, right? So we see this community leadership taking a role in selecting some of those leaders that adjudicate and decide what happens in police misconduct cases, and we've seen a backlash. So in the past year, the union has taken action to remove some of the authority of that police board, to remove their ability to really take on and make decisions with respect to those police misconduct cases, perhaps in part due to the more community-rooted nature of the leadership of that police board. So we know that the work to create this infrastructure is not over, that it is critically important to ensure that we have a justice system and a police department that really serves the needs of the communities that we live in, and that it will have reactions. And so the work to continue to pursue it is really important. I'll say one last thing, if I can, which is this work is critical not only for the city of Chicago, but for this region and for this country. The model that was created by the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Ordinance is now the most democratically grounded oversight body of a police department in the United States. It serves as a model for municipalities in the region. The Chicago Police Department is the largest policing agency in the state of Illinois, and so other departments and state entities look to it as a model, and the rest of the country is watching as well. So it's really important that as we think about the structures that are created to move forward the kind of values that we're all working for here, that we continue to invest in those structures. Think about what's going well, where there are challenges that can be met, because it will have ramifications for the city of Chicago, for this region, and for the country for a really long time. So thank you for all the work that's gone into by this community and by so many others getting us to this point, and there's more work to come. Thanks.
Let's see if I can put this back up here and move it toward me a little.
All right.
I'm Harriet Dart, and I served as the chair of the Justice and Witness Ministry team of the Chicago Metropolitan Association of the United Church of Christ during the time when we were very aggressively working towards eliminating money bail. And as you said, Kara, this is a model that the rest of the country is looking to. Illinois is the first state to completely eliminate money bond as a way of bond. And if you advance, money bond essentially takes money out of poor community. It extracts the wealth from the poor communities. And and is used, sadly enough, much of the money that's put up for bond, only about 20% of it is returned to the people. And so that continues to build distrust with the whole criminal system. And one of the things that
Why?
why what?
Why is it not returned?
Well, that's a question for someone else.
Okay.
I don't know why, but what happens, the family pays the fee, and once it's the court case is settled, the money is absorbed by some of the court systems. They actually use it for their budget, right? Perhaps that was the answer you were looking for.
It's very expensive to be charged with a crime.
Exactly. And as you were talking about the last meeting, traffic stops can lead to a disaster. You make a wrong turn, or you have they just released a list of a taillight out. And that can be, when you lose you're in jail, you can lose your house, you can lose your job. It just spins downward. But let's look at so what's happened? We heard fear-mongering that this is just going to be terrible, the streets are going to be. What's actually happened is that, of course, the population in the jails is down. There have been some jails that have been closed downstate. Another thing is that there's consistency across the state of Illinois. Some of this is not just a Cook County issue. In rural counties, there's underfunding and things like that. So one thing we know is money's beginning to stay in those vulnerable communities. They can maintain their employment, their family stability, keep their housing. One of the requirements now is that there must be legal counsel present at the hearing. And so the hearings are more robust. So it's clogging the system a little bit. So one of the things that as we go towards the end here about the Pretrial Success Act is to properly fund this so that the prosecutors and the attorneys and the defense are able to have more consistency. Other things that the Pretrial Fairness Act, which was actually signed into law in 22, but then went to the Supreme Court, but finally implemented in September of 2023, is to modify the electronic monitoring. There are some monitoring is like a different type of incarceration. So in some counties, the people wearing the ankle bracelets had to pay for them themselves. And so that financial burden is relieved, and it's also required every 60 days to return that to see if that's appropriate. How is it going? It's only 6 months. So the fear that it was going to be terrible, it was going to be fantastic, we don't know that yet. And so the Loyola Center for Criminal Justice is collecting data. And it's, from the data, we can draw a conclusion to see whether, as you read the report so far from Loyola, it's quite academic. So as I was reading it, I was really appreciating the value of investigative journalism, because they keep us on target as things are happening right now. And is it going to be like they predicted? We'll see. For one thing we know is that they're going to be required to make some tweaks to the law, some tweaks to the support of the people going back to court. Originally, the idea is bail keeps communities safer, and they return to court for their trial. Actually, there's no evidence. There's no data supporting that. In fact, the data of keeping communities safer actually is the opposite. And so the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice has created a vision of what is needed for the success of the Pretrial Fairness Act. And some of those things include, and I do have a handout on the piano, access to some voluntary services. It's voluntary. They're not required to go to mental health, but if they choose it themselves, the much higher success rate. There'll be court reminders to go to court, some Uber or some support for getting transportation to court, and simply some childcare. To have childcare in the court would make a difference. So this whole act is to be a more holistic look at criminal justice and working with impact, exactly, so that we look at it from a much broader perspective. And so there's investment in the community, in housing, mental and physical health care, education, jobs. It's a whole all of this, and are we as a community? And that we're again working towards community safety, so that there's more the resources that once paid for keeping people in jail can be invested in the community. And then we have to look at, a budget is a moral document. How much budget goes to supporting the jail and how much budget is shifted to other things. So those are things that there are some acts and there's some pending legislation that will address that. Because really, have we made poverty a crime in this country? Poverty is not a crime. So keep that. So that's what thank you. I'll take your questions later.
Okay, thank you both. My part is a little brief, but let me just start with saying that we've heard a little bit about police work and the policing system. We've heard about some of the legislation that had been passed and how that's being implemented and how that's going. But there's also a lot of pending legislation. It's not just a one-shot thing. It's a process. And so legislation is evolving all the time to make progress in terms of criminal justice. And there are things that are proposed and things that are passed and things that fail. And it's a big job to keep track of all that. We lean on two organizations here in the church that we work with to get some more information about what's going on legislatively and what kind of legislation is upcoming. And these two organizations are Restore Justice and then Live Free Illinois. They do more than that, but they do a very good job of keeping track and advocating for progressive criminal justice legislation. And some of them are things that are not just Illinois, but we have an Illinois chapter, say, of Live Free, for instance, and Restore Justice works a lot in Illinois as well. So what are some of those things? A lot of the work that's been started has been started with sentencing and trying to get people sentenced properly and fairly. And we have several pieces of legislation that are been proposed that have elements of fairness and things that we would like to see passed. The first one you see at the top, I know it's pretty small and hard to read, but again, if you want more information on this, we can get more information, or you can see this presentation yourself. I'll send it to you. But one of the things that is being proposed is to change the way that charges are levied if a weapon is involved. And there's a difference between using a weapon in a crime or possessing a weapon, but that distinction is not made in sentencing. So just the fact that you have a gun, even if it wasn't used in the commission of a crime, or if it's been a weapon that you weren't supposed to be in possession of, you can use that. That can be used against you in a court. And the problem is that if an employer sees that you were charged with a crime that involved a weapon, they have no idea whether it was used, whether you just had it, those kinds of things. So the reaction to that can be very negative for the person who was charged. So there's some legislation there to change that. You've heard a little bit about some of the things that Harriet's talked about and Karen talked about also in terms of support for some of the services that people who have been incarcerated may need coming out of prison and or jail. And I won't go into that, but there is some funding legislation for some of those changes that need to be made there. Another sentencing thing is to create real parole opportunities for people, young people that have been charged in a crime, and it allows them, if they were younger than 21 at the time that this happened, to benefit from some of the changes that have recently occurred, to allow them to be able to take advantage of some of the parole opportunities. Currently, they're not allowed to. So then there's also the use of the accountability theory, which allows people to be charged. If allows you to be charged with and convicted of a crime that you did not plan or agree to, but you just happen to be there or be associated with that. The accountability is not going to be extended to you if you really did not participate in that. And so there's some sentencing changes that need to be made there. I'm going to pass it off to Sue Sporty, who's going to talk about some of the other opportunities.
So before I do, I just want to say that many of you, remember we had a conversation a while back about what are witness slips, and some of you signed up to be on a list so that if any of these emerging pieces of legislation get to a point where they're being debated on the floor, you can turn in a witness slip. You don't have to give any reasons. You just have to say, I am in favor of this law. Submit it online, da 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 da. So if you need a refresher on that, fine. If you're not on the list and want to be, there will be a sign-up sheet on the piano when you leave, okay? Because one actually did just come recently, only it came like on a Wednesday and they needed it back on like a Friday. So since we haven't talked about this in a long time and there was no way, anyway, so this is now your mental alert. You might get an email that says, could you please send a witness slip for Senate bill number, blah, blah, blah. And this is what the legislation is about. You don't have to do it, but it's a way of being quickly responding. All right, so Bruce talked about sentencing. I'm going to talk about release. So what if somebody is already in jail? And he already talked about one of the laws, or one of the things that has been discovered in relatively recent time, is that the brain when you're 16 may not be a fully formed brain, and you may not be as responsible for your actions at 16 as you might be at 25. And the law was changed in Illinois that made use of that fact. But if you were sentenced before 2014 or so, there you are, you're sentenced at the age of 15, but it was a while ago, you were not covered by that law. So the opportunities for release now gives you the opportunity to petition for parole using youth or some other thing as a mitigating circumstance. The rollback for truth in sentencing, Illinois is among the 16 worst states in giving parole or giving reduced sentence time. That's not a good place, in my opinion. In my opinion, that's not a good place for us to be, but we are. So the hope is that we don't provide early release. You can be as good as you want in jail. You can take courses. You can become a really good citizen. But if your original sentence said 40 years, sorry, there you are. So there's a bill that would address that there could be some way of, or some enhanced ways of petitioning. And then this is more about kids sentenced back in the day. Young offenders retroactively. So let's say you filed for parole once. You were one of these kids, back in 1992, and you were 15, and you already filed once for parole. You can't really, it's really hard to do it again, even though now they know that at 16 your brain was not formed. So this is to say, it's a very directed kind of law that just says, okay, for this group of people, they need to have more opportunities. And then finally, conditions of incarceration. I don't know whether you recently heard about the guy in Louisiana who'd been held in solitary confinement for 44 years. He was a Black Panther. He was one of the founders of the Black Panther. And in Louisiana, that was apparently considered a heinous thing. A lot of people are still held. And I will admit that if I were a prison guard and that were one of my tools, I might use it more than I should. I would like to believe I wouldn't. But there are more than one side to that story. And yet there has to be some kind of oversight, that you can't just put somebody in solitary and leave that person there for years and years and years and years and years. Even if that person is deemed to be a danger to the prison community, there has to be some recourse where periodically that person's case is reviewed. Is he, she still a danger, or can be readmitted to the prison population? So this bill is currently, this is the one actually that we just got, no, not the one, but it is one that I think will be coming up for us to talk about, that if you're in solitary confinement, you need to be allowed to be out of your cell for 4 hours in a day. Whether there's a guard with you or whatever, you don't have to be in that single cell 24/7. So, Karen.
Okay, so I'm Karen Grimes. I am the chair of Pilgrim's Sacred Conversations on Race Committee and a member of this committee. I'm here to speak about some of the Live Free Illinois initiatives. They have many. I got to know Arjanice Myrick even more through Sue and my working with her on our local Congregations Networking for Social Justice group, and she has been very instrumental in helping us plan. She is one of the most energizer bunnies I have ever seen. I'm getting emails from her. She's all over the state. She's in DC right now and sending me emails at my request. So I just waited to see, is there no email? And then, oh, here it comes in DC. But what I was trying to do is, I had gone to the opening. There's two things I'm going to talk about. There are many violence prevention campaigns. One of which is not a policy-related issue, but it's their community healing resource centers. To get at a community-based way to help heal those who have been affected by violence, who maybe don't have access to mental health care, or are returning from jail, all of the above. There's 12 community healing resource center sites in the state of Illinois. I'll just kind of go around. I went to the opening in Austin. There's in North Lawndale, Humboldt Park, Garfield Park, Englewood, Morgan Park, Chicago Heights. And then outside of the Chicago area, they have Springfield, Champaign, and Peoria. So they don't do things small, they go large. And so I think these are in the process of opening. They are being funded by the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. If you kind of go to the next slide. There's additional funding being requested right now under Senate Bill 3226. Which has been voted into the Senate Appropriations Committee, so it'd be considered one of those pending kinds of things. But I think that they even have this funding as an acknowledgement of their place in the scheme of things by the powers that be, that they're getting this funding to this really very important work. I also, though, want to talk about their Clean Slate initiative. They are doing teach-ins. I went to one of the ones that Artenise had over at Grace Lutheran over in River Forest. That is always available to our community also. She is very willing to go anywhere that people want to hear her to teach. It's a national movement or campaign. Our program here in Illinois has a whole range of organizations, including Live Free, that are supporting it. The problem that they've identified is over 3 million Illinoisans have arrest or conviction records, and that follows them. And it leads to permanent punishments, even when you've done your time and come home. Things on your that we've talked about. You can do your time and still come home and have these things. And to appeal to those who don't care as much is the financial repercussions to the state of Illinois. $4.7 billion, well, it's probably nationally, in lost annual income for people with arrests and convictions. That doesn't just affect those people, it affects the whole economy. And so it's a thing of justice that doesn't serve any of us. Go to the next slide. So there are 2.2 million Illinoisans currently eligible to have their arrests expunged, but it is backlogged, and 90% of Illinoisans haven't even started the process because it is so complicated. And so this whole clean slate thing is to try to expedite it and make it simpler and automatic so that it is not so difficult. You want to go to the next one? And Clean Slate will automate the records relief, eliminate court backlogs, create new opportunities, and make it easier for qualified individuals to get well-paying jobs. Now, since her one-pager that she sent me said so much more than I could put on slides, in the back there are things that will also give you more things. But on the page, it talks about the bill is going to make it more efficient, the automatic, that's said. Automatic sealing for most felony convictions, not all, but most, set a timetable and create avenues to ensure that non-citizens can access their sealed and expunged records for immigration purposes also, which is another key topic right now. And so there is a website that you can get more information about too. So that completes mine.
Okay, so thank everybody for your part here. We're going to have question and answer in a minute, but just a few final takeaways from what we've talked about today. You can see here there's a lot of things that have been done, but there's a lot of legislation that still needs your support. We also have seen that no cash bail, which was a big effort, has been very successful, but it still needs financial supports and financial resources are necessary to make that even more successful. So those bills that are up for approval, definitely need our support in order to make this worthwhile and a reality. Community health resources are an important part of this as well, because it's preventative and it's helpful for those people that have been incarcerated or people that might fall into that situation. And then finally, for those people that have done what they were supposed to do, paid their debt to society, quote unquote, they need a second chance. They need a ability to wipe the slate clean, to start over, and we need to affect that for them, to make that a reality so they can live the lives that they would like to lead. So with that, I want to thank the people online for joining us, and thank you for those that are here today. And if the audience members have any questions, feel free. Kelly?
Has anyone been looking at the recidivism rate in Illinois? Pre-cash bail, post-cash bail?
Should I?
Yeah.
Can we, there hasn't actually been time. Sally's question was about the recidivism rate following the pretrial Fairness Act implementation. Sally, because it's really only been in place for about 6 months, the concept of whether someone reoffends if they were not held in custody prior to their trial we haven't had the time to measure it. As Harriet talked about, what the Pretrial Fairness Act is looking at and what's being measured right now, and so far the data is early but positive, is whether people show up, right? And whether they offend while they are out waiting for trial. Again, data preliminary, but positive. In other words, you see people showing up for their hearings, and you do not see sort of a spike in crime associated with people being released. And that is because cash bail, while it was in place, wasn't really targeted to those criteria. We didn't really look at who was likely to reappear and who was likely to offend while they were awaiting trial. We looked at who could pay. Right, and so now the criteria are more focused on people who are accused of very serious violent crimes. They're more likely to be held actually now than they were before, because they can't just pay to get out. And people who are charged with low offenses or have reason to think will reappear are more likely to be released. So we've aligned what we're trying to achieve with the way the court system is operating.
Is the reason for lack of money because they're not doing cash bail, so that they're not getting that money? And, you said we need more money for what? I wasn't real clear. Continual financial resources are needed for which part of this process?
For the community health centers,
Investment.
and also for some of the investment programs that help people that have been incarcerated, as well as those who we're trying to prevent from being in that situation.
Let's just.
So it really has nothing to do with bail.
I think it's more the point of investment in communities.
Okay.
And where is the money going to go? Are you going to go to put money in incarceration and cages, or are you going to put money into mental health centers and supporting people? And that's more money. Let's change the direction of where the money's going.
And I also just would like to say, just as a very common sense, if you are a low-level offender and you're not in jail, you're at your house, you're buying groceries, you're putting money out into the community rather than the jail needing to buy your food. And so there's more money flowing in the community that the community ideally could put into mental health and other stuff.
And on a very practical level, some of it does have to do with how the court system operates as well. So if you are charged with a crime in Cook County, it's very difficult, even in the quick court hearings that you're a part of, to figure out when you need to come back, where you're supposed to go, how long you're supposed to be there, do you need to take off work? The practical elements of just getting through the time before a trial are very significant impediments to people, and because failure to appear can cause you to then be arrested and held, the consequences are very significant. So some of this money literally goes to things like pushing out a text message so someone knows when their court hearing is. Very, very practical things to ensure that the standards that we're holding people to, we're actually enabling them to know when to appear and how to do it. So it's all of those things and some practical things too.
Dave was next. Dave.
Oh, I have a question on the post, when people are released, Does Illinois, that's just ignorance on my part, does Illinois allow voting for convicted criminals? Okay.
Kathleen.
I'm looking at your list of support groups, and I'm very curious. I know the UCC and the UUs are active. Are there any other denominations who are working with you from a justice point of view?
Oh, your question was about other denominations on people who are released. I don't know the answer to that. I know locally the Methodist church here in town, Euclid Avenue Methodist, active. Kathleen? Jenny, sorry.
I understand though. So Kara mentioned the police union backlash in your comments, and it made me think about the community-wide backlash. So thinking about why these why these changes are so threatening to the voter base, the community at large, because this entire system is how we've been told keeps us safe. So is there any activity or dialogue or work kind of trying to hold up and reflect and challenge that? A lot of these, I mean, these are essential, and the resources are being targeted at the issues of the problems and the communities that have been disinvested. Is there any bandwidth or activity on sort of the other group that ends up being the decision makers of why all these policies continue to be implemented?
Well, I would partly say that the Loyola study on the effect of this now might be a factor, but you're talking about public opinion, how to influence and persuade public opinion.
And why any one example of fear-mongering tends to be so effective, because many of us are brought up to believe that this is what keeps us safe, so how do we promote that?
Right. So, Jenny, as I understand your question is, how do we let facts change opinions of people who've been taught that putting people in jail keeps the community safe?
Is there anything in motion in that direction that we can add to?
I'm going to defer to someone else.
I'm so eager to talk for the next hour about your question. I think it's so important. On the facts strategy, I will say, yes, there are groups that are trying to bring data and research to that question. Impact for Equity has done an extensive study on traffic stops, for example, to really look at whether or not they produce public safety, right? Is this tool that we've been taught to believe makes us safer? Does it do it? The answer is no. The data is overwhelming, and I can talk about that for a very long time, maybe next time. The bigger picture question about how do we really change the narrative about what makes us safe and what causes significant harm is a longer term conversation. It's why this group is so exciting. Conversations like this, where people come together to learn and to live into their values, are somewhat uncommon. And I will say, if I may, just in terms of the policymakers, this congregation in particular is so well situated to be having conversations because, of course, we do sit geographically in a place where, with respect to state policymakers, including the President of the Senate, are located and connected with this community. So, I was really struck, Sue, when you were talking about some of the legislative changes that are proposed with respect to increasing opportunities for parole, right? We don't really have a functioning parole system in Illinois. We are an outlier in that regard, and the legislation that you hear about is terrific, and we are a part of it, and it is piecemeal, right? So the broader conversation about what it means why do we incarcerate people, and what's the objective we're trying to serve, those conversations are really very much need to happen, and need to happen with policymakers, right? Policymakers need to be hearing from communities like this one about our broader goals, the broader values that we would like to see being embodied in Illinois law, and what we think makes us safer and what we know doesn't make us safer. So more conversations absolutely needed. Those are happening in various spaces, but spaces like this are somewhat unique and really, really important.
Do we have time for one last question? Or not? Yes, Jane Ann.
Back to bail, hasn't it been traditionally so that the person or the company extending the money for the cost of the bail has gotten some of the money for themselves, for the company, for the
Yeah, we don't allow bail bondsmen in Illinois. That is illegal in the state. Other states do have systems of bail bondsmen, and that's a whole other troubling aspect of that industry. Just as Harriet said, in Illinois, the way this typically works is there are family members. So literally, prior to this legislation, when someone was being held and was preparing to appear before the court, you had public defenders essentially saying, like, can your mom put up the money? Can your girlfriend put up the money? Like, it is an effort to, I'm going to say shake down family members or friends of people who are awaiting a determination of whether they will be freed on bail, and those are the people that are pitching in to make bail for someone. So that's harmful in many ways that are probably very plain, but it is different than a private bail bonds industry.
So really, the money really is going to the court system.
Yeah. The money is held by the court system, and then I think what Harriet was alluding to is there are also, aside from bail, right, which in theory was designed to incentivize you to appear for your trial, there are also a number of fees that are associated with being a defendant. The cost of electronic monitoring, the cost of having your case heard. Fines and fees are another significant problem, and so the money gets eaten away because ultimately, if you take a plea, you're going to be responsible for those fees, and so that's where the money goes, in some cases.
I just do want to jump in and just say, I'm on Nextdoor, those of you that are on Facebook, I'm sure you hear negative reactions to this. I hear all the time that this crime occurred because we don't have cash bail anymore, because the government's letting them out, etc. So I think after with a little bit of your information here, I can respond on those sites in ways that I haven't. I've been kind of quiet. And, I can say the facts show right now, preliminary facts, that that's not happening, that while they're awaiting trial, they're not. The cash bail has nothing to do with what you're saying, So we can also be advocates for that in our social media spaces.
All right, you guys.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, for the copy of the presentation and the sign-up sheet, and the church will also have it available on its website.
And anybody that didn't pick up one of these and wants one, they're in the back on the piano.
And